All right. Well, first of all, Alex, thank you so much for being with us today. Incredibly excited for the conversation, and I know your background across both traditional and digital media gives you such an awesome basis to chat with us about some of the trends in the space. For those in the room, this is Alex Wallace. She's the VP of Entertainment and Oath Studios. Let's start with a little bit of an introduction on your background, and then we'll go into more of the trends.
Well, I actually think I'm very on point this morning, as my life is convergence. So I spent 27 years in traditional media and at both CBS and NBC, and have spent the last few years in digital. And now at Oath, running entertainment, our entertainment vertical, which is a bunch of brands, including Yahoo Entertainment, Riot, which is an AR, VR documentary company, Build, which is a live studio we have down on Broadway, and Makers, which is our female storytelling division, and Oath Studios, which is our video creation across all of Oath.
Right. And I think with your content backgrounds, you have a lot of basis in seeing mobile and digital driving growth, which we saw from our outlook. PwC also recently did a VideoQuake study, which looks at changes from traditional to OTT television, and we found that 54% of consumers had trim, cut, or never used the cord as of this year. When you think about that shift to a mobile and digital first experience with mobile and digital driving growth, what trends are you seeing specific to the consumer experience and how you engage with consumers meaningfully in a digital mobile way?
So I think we have, in some ways, the business is behind the consumer, because we're still organized in terms of, you're a telco, you're a digital company, you're a traditional media company. I mean, that, to the previous panel, that is not at all how the consumer views this. The consumer is somewhat screen agnostic. It's the screen that's closest to them. I think it's really interesting about projecting your kids projecting their slime videos onto the television. I see the exact same thing with my kid. I think we have to think about every screen, and I think we have to think about the context in which people are consuming content. And so how do you, both as a storyteller, which is what I am, and as an advertiser, how do you take advantage of all the contextual data we now have and the geolocation data we have as we tell stories across a person's day and as we advertise across a person's day? And so I think a lot about, like, how are you talking to me on my phone versus how are you talking to me in my car when we have driverless cars? That's going to be a very large media consumption place. How are you talking to me from the screen on my refrigerator? And kind of how do you tell that story across the day? I think about my purchasing journey, and it starts with, you need to know what part of my day you're in as you're talking to me. I usually probably convert to a purchase at, 8 p.m. So don't be at 8 a.m. talking to me as if I'm about to buy something, and don't tell me the exact same message at 8 a.m. that you are at 8 p.m. And I think that's the same for storytelling and advertising, which is that we need to be very kind of right context, right screen as we go across the consumer journey.
And one of the things, and sorry folks, I always forget to introduce myself. Fortunately, Mark did it for me. CJ Bangah, I focus on digital advertising technology, and I'm West Coast based. And so when we were getting ready for this session earlier, we were talking about in context ads, we were talking about frequency capping. We spoke a bit about how consumers very much don't mind advertising that appeals to them because it's interesting and feels relevant and doesn't feel intrusive. But we see consumers very much shying away from advertising that takes them out of the experience and disrupts them. When you think about consumer experiences and you think about advertising in particular, what's your perspective on where you trial and experiment and see what reactions you get to drive innovation, whereas where you just jump into the deep end of the pool with a really big bet?
So two thoughts. I think we need to be as iterative in advertising as we are in content. I mean, I think about content as a completely iterative experience now. I think we need to try a lot of things. And the great thing is, 3 days into a new show, you know how it's doing. And so while you can't just do everything, you have to let some green shoots grow. But if you plant a bunch of seeds and you watch them and there's nothing green showing up, remove those seeds. You water the seeds where there's a little bit, and then you really water the seeds where you're seeing green shoots. So I think that's how I think about content and show development, but I think we need to be the same way about advertising, and there needs to be as much innovation in advertising as there is in content development. And I say this, I have nothing to do with Instagram, but I am kind of obsessed with Instagram ads now because I love them. And we were talking about this earlier. You used to buy the Vogue September issue because they had all the amazing ads, which is kind of a funny thing to say because, it used to be like, well, I'm buying it to see the amazing content, but you'd actually buy it as much for the ads. I love Instagram because of the ads. And for me to say that, they are doing something very right. They feel very, very appropriate. There are enough of them. They very much know who I am. And it's completely native to my experience. So while I'm not going on there, usually I'm going on there to see some cute video a friend has posted, I am equally impressed with what the advertisers are serving there.
Yeah. I think something you've touched on is related to innovation and experimentation. When you think about the business model evolution connected into Convergence 1, 2, 3.0, or whatever mental model or framework works best for you, what do you think are some of the most important business model evolutions that companies need to think about today to compete and win in the entertainment and media space?
So I think there are a couple things. One is diversification of revenue. You cannot count just on advertising. And so I think, it's funny, people used to think content was free, but it was never free. It was just paid for by the advertiser. So we've always paid for content. And so now I think being very, very transparent with the consumer about how much content costs to make and that they have to pay for it in some format. They can pay for it by watching ads. They can pay for it by getting a subscription. I think it's really interesting. Hulu has two models. Hulu has an ad and an ad-free model. You pay differently. I think being very transparent, Twitch has done a lot of this where they're very transparent with the consumer about this costs us money to do, and as a result, you have to watch advertising. It's the same thing I think that's going to happen around data, which is ultimately people are going to either give you your data, which is a form of payment, or they're going to keep their data and they will have to pay money in a different way. So I think diversification of revenue is super, super important. And then the other thing I think a lot about is that this is another convergence thing, is that content and technology have really merged too, and that you really have to think about them together. We're doing a lot of hackathons where we have engineers and storytellers sitting at the same table and really thinking about what does that look like. I would say, one of the little bubbles up here was gaming. I think gaming and watching are actually also merging. And, that's where the most interesting sparks are happening, I think, is when you get people from very different formats and backgrounds at the table together.
One of the things we also talked about earlier is how we're seeing, and we use the Pokemon Go example and the Fortnite example, in some cases across gaming and AR, the beginning of industries disrupting or evolving or just being that early stage kind of sign of where things are going. When you think about augmented reality and when you think about some of those transformations on business models, what's your perspective on what's next?
So I don't mean to be controversial when I say this, but I'm a little bit less bullish on VR right now just because I think it's bad for my hair. That nasty box you have to wear on your face all the time. I mean, look, I'm obsessed with VR. I think as a storyteller, it's amazing. You watch it, you're like, oh my God, I can't believe I'm in Africa with those children, and it's amazing. But the reality is it's not a social experience. And so what I would say is VR eventually we will walk into a room and it'll all be immersive content. And so then VR will obviously, what'll happen is there'll be some form of a much better headset, or it'll be an ocular device, or, it's something, a new way of consuming VR involving hardware will evolve. So I'm I'm bullish on VR in the long run. I just think in the short run, you don't go to a party and put a box on your face. So, but I think AR is massive. And I think that's where you're going to see the next couple years. Again, VR moving along in terms of content innovation, but until the hardware is better, I think AR we're at the very, very beginning, and I think concerts are going to be changed. I think Eminem has started experimenting with some AR. I think AR is going to change everything we do.
Great perspective, and we added VR to our entertainment media outlook a couple years ago, and I think that when you hear people who are driving VR projects in the space, they're incredibly bullish on the potential and on the opportunity because of the potential for that immersive experience, but losing that social connection that draws you out of sharing in some ways can be disruptive. We do still see tremendous growth on AR. Our intent is to start pulling that data in as soon as it's available, but clear opportunities from a case study perspective.
The reason I would just say I think it's really interesting when you look at Gen Z is this whole idea of experience. It's not just experiential content. They actually want to have real experiences. The amount of wallet that is spent on experiences versus things is larger than in past generations. And so I think that's when you think about content too, it's got to be experiential. Yeah. And again, that's why I think VR struggles a little bit is there's no social component right now to VR. It will get there, and then it will be amazing. And eventually you'll be in a virtual sports bar, like trash talking your team, and it'll be amazing. I just don't think we're there yet.
All right. So speaking of where we are, mobile first is definitely a thing, and Oath and Verizon and a number of different companies that have all consolidated have amassed a very impressive mobile infrastructure, mobile offering, also digital offerings. When you think about consumer OTT in particular, where do you see mobile fitting?
I mean, look, mobile is everything. So it's mobile morning, noon, and night. So I don't know what is not mobile. Again, I think it's all a kind of continuum of how you're consuming content, and that it should be modified for the screen on which it should be modified. What I'm doing on my phone really is different than what I'm doing on that large box that I have to explain to people as a television in my house. And so, I do think a little bit of kind of lean forward and lean back. And, in general, I'm leaning back when I'm watching on a large screen. And in general, I'm leaning forward. I'm much more kind of interacting with the content that's on my phone. But look, I mean, it's phone. And, there are countries where it's phone only. And I mean, that is definitely that's the first screen, not the second screen.
So diving into your countries comment, when we look internationally, there are countries that have not historically had the infrastructure to get online through broadband fixed internet access projections. One of the things we found from the outlook this year is smartphone-based internet access is just growing like gangbusters. And when you think about international rollout, when you think about mobile in international markets, what's the importance of international, and how do you think about fit between how you approach US consumers and international consumers?
So I think a couple things. One, content is super expensive, so you have to think globally. We're in a fairly mature market, at least in content. So I think and then I think you have to think about what is global and what is local, because you can't just show up with what you think is like this really cute program in India and expect that they're going to love it. So I think the question is, how much of content is global, how much of content is local, and what's that right mix? But I do think that's the area that's the most interesting right now is the global markets. I mean, if you look at markets like South Korea, Indonesia, and there are some learnings. It's actually like I feel badly every day that I'm not in Asia, because I think there's some really interesting learnings and things that are happening over there around membership, around points, that are probably predicting where we're going. And so I think we have to be, at this point, almost global first in how we think about this. And again, the other thing I would say is, like IP, when I think about what's the real value of what we do in media, it's IP and owning your IP. And I think the companies that have been very smart have thought about how do you take IP and make it global IP. So yes, I will be not here next year. I will be in Asia.
And then one of the things that surprised me being involved with the Outlook over the last few years is the number of movies and content that Nigeria produces, looking at international ways that consumers are engaging with content. You gave some examples of essentially gamification of media, right? You're creating fans, you're incentivizing engagement, and it is starting to transform the market. And so I'm not sure if you're joking about going to Asia or if it's a serious thing. I can't tell from a head shake what you mean by that either,
No,
but I
not
definitely,
joking.
you're not joking, okay. I do think there's a lot to learn, and it's also interesting because you see these moments where markets are able to leapfrog more mature markets because they don't have the mature market hangups, right? They don't have the mature market infrastructure, they don't have the mature market business model, and so you get this very disruptive, interesting environment where because they don't have this way of it's always been done that way, in some cases, some cases we see innovation outstrip us because there isn't that mental model of, oh, I work with this person who has this middleman who has this person, and then it's this experience. They'll skip straight to the experience and then up-level that experience a couple steps as well.
I think it's really interesting, and I think it's very hard for legacy media. This is where I would say I think it's very hard for legacy companies, having been at a few, because so much of your money is made in the traditional way, and so it's harder to look for the green shoots because you're still watering your trees all day. And I do think that's where kind of keeping an eye, I forget there's some like business school term for like really keeping an eye on the periphery, because innovation is going to happen mostly or often where people are not encumbered by their past business models, and they're not encumbered by their past, so if you go to a traditional media company, kind of traditionally it's been that the best and the brightest are working in where the most money comes in, and that's not the tip of the spear. That's really the like bread and butter of a company.
All right, so building a little bit on differentiation, and we were talking about that this morning when we were talking about how consumers are driving so much of the decision making. You mentioned it earlier on stage. Personalization is a big part of putting the consumer in that driver's seat and allowing them not only freedom of choice and consistency and experience across a number of different devices, but also relevance of content. You used the Instagram example. How do you think about what's most important when you think about personalization and putting the consumer first and how you approach engaging with them?
I think there are a couple things. One, I think that personalization is obviously everything. However, I also think it's really important. We have this module we call the need to know. I think it's very important that you remember the mix of what you want to know and what you need to know. And I think that speaks to like filter bubbles. And like if I ate just what I wanted to eat, it would probably be gummy bears all day. And then my teeth would fall out, which would be probably worse than my knocking earring. So I think it's really important that we have, as creators of content, think about, this comes from my news background, like there are some things you need to know. I want to give people mostly what they want to know, but I think it's really important. It's where curation comes in, and it is the filter bubble thing. You can't just have people, because otherwise people will go into smaller and smaller and smaller boxes, and then they're sitting with 3 people who feel exactly like them. And so I think it's important to have a mix of kind of personalization, but also like human curation. And I mean, that's where I have to say I love Oath, is that we really, no one does it perfectly, but I think we have a pretty nice mix of like algorithm and humans. And I think that's probably the best way to do it.
And I think on the topic of algorithms and humans, one thing we've also talked about is content discovery. We've seen artificial intelligence be used in a pretty impactful way to funnel people into targeted groups and make recommendations. I destroy my husband's recommendation engine all the time. He was like, I do not want to see a strong female lead, quirky comedy, strong female lead, sci-fi. Like,
Right.
What are you doing to my queue? Yeah. But I think outside of those who share profiles, you can have, and it's perfectly targeted for me, just not for him. You can have some really interesting things happening with AI. We also have seen consumer studies where what a friend tells them is valued more than what the computer tells them. And so this balance of having content discovery and reaching consumers in a way that balances tech and humans is a really interesting area to look at. How do you envision content discovery of the future, and where do you think it needs to improve to get to that next level?
Well, so I think we're also in another period where there's been the great unbundling, where the consumer just wanted to get what they want when they want it. and the whole DTC thing, which is obviously where the trend is. The one thing I would say as a consumer, and I think, and it's not just me, it's based on data, is it's super hard to find things now because everyone's like gone DTC. So I think we're going to get into a much more kind of, we'll go back towards some kind of personalized bundle. And when I mean bundle, I don't mean just cable traditional. It'll be kind of a complement of content that will come to me in different formats, but will be rebundled for me. Because I do think it is really complicated right now to find what you want, to find what you, there's so much data about me right now out there that you should be serving me. I'm a pretty knowable thing, we all are, if you consume a lot of content. And I don't think anyone has kind of perfected the, discovery has clearly not been perfected, and then kind of personalized discovery has not been perfected. I think it's a really big opportunity.
Building on that, when you think about the consumer experience, PwC just did a consumer study on how much more consumers would be willing to pay for a great experience, and we found that there was a up to 16% price premium for delivering a great experience, and we also found that 1 in 3 consumers will walk away from a brand after just one bad experience, and their tolerance for bad experiences and their price premium for what they'll pay for a great experience varies by country and varies by the type of content. But when you think about the consumer experience, what components do you think are most important to get right, or what's your perception on what you've seen consumers value the most?
I think that the consumer just wants to be like appreciated, and they just want to know that you're paying attention. I think we think a lot about members. You don't want just drive-by all day, because like drive-by consumers are fairly easy to get, but you want people who come back and come back and come back every day, 10 times a day. And so I think like showing a little bit of love to your consumers is really important. I've been flying a ton recently, and like it is amazing how not well you get treated on airplanes a lot. And I'm like, really? Could you just say hello? I mean, I'm not that complicated, like maybe a bottle of water. And it's just the little things, and I think it's really important that we, you look at brands who are really good to their consumers, and I think that's where like your willingness to pay, your willingness to uppay is pretty limitless. I'm shocked how many brands don't say thank you to me, and that's all I want, like just thank you and a bottle of water, and I'd be fine.
I think you probably have a reasonable but somewhat like relatively easy to achieve bar. All right, so we have time for one final question, and you've gone a little bit into consumer experience and creating fans, and I'll leave you a little bit of open space just to share with the group your perspective on creating fans and really just being super successful and getting folks into your network and getting them to really engage with you in a meaningful way where not only are they consistently engaging, but they're also engaging and telling their friends about it and being somebody that can amplify your brand, your voice, the value of doing business with a company like Oath.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, our top of the funnel is massive. We have massive daily reach, but I think a lot about how do you get, and again, those are people that like maybe say hello to you in the morning. And then how do you get to people who like you? And ultimately you have to get to people who love you. And so I do think fandom, like really, really deepening your connection with every single person who you're talking to all day is super, super, super important. I would rather have 10 people who love me than 100 people who are like, meh.
I hate to have you end on meh, but thank you so much for coming and speaking with us today. Definitely appreciate it.
Thank you.